Thanks. So I'm going to, for our newbie nugget, talk about mixins. So what is a mixin? So luckily, Wikipedia to the rescue. They have a pretty good definition and a pretty good page on it. But it's basically a class that's not meant for direct instantiation and where you're not using the inheritance for specializing classes, but rather using it to basically collect different functionality. And you typically use multiple inheritance to combine your mixins together. And so this is useful when you want to have multiple orthogonal features that you're going to combine in arbitrary ways. So here's a little example. So let's say you're building an adventure game and you want to create a bunch of different kinds of doors for your maze. So we'll have a base class door, we'll have locked doors, short doors, magic doors. So then we can, if these are considered mixins, we can kind of combine them together as a lock, short, magic door using multiple inheritance. And so great, this is something you couldn't do in Java. So what kind of language support is there for mixin? So in some other languages, they do have direct language support. Python does not, but that's okay because we have multiple inheritance and direct access to the meta object protocol. So we can do all kinds of things that will allow us to implement various mixin styles. So you're typically going to use multiple inheritance to implement these mixins, and this can cause some issues. First one is method resolution order. The second is conflicts with internal states between the classes. And the third is being able to compose methods across mixins. So method resolution order is about basically figuring out what methods you're going to call and who overrides who when you're using, and it's very straight. If you have just single inheritance, then you have a linear sequence of classes, and it's pretty straightforward. But as soon as you have multiple inheritance, you're going to start running into problems where you have multiple base classes. You have multiple base classes that may have common subclasses, and so it gets complicated. And they changed how this worked in Python 2.3. And basically, there's a restriction that if your subclass hierarchy cannot be linearized, you'll get an error from Python. And in addition, just having this, it can get complicated to reason about, right? To try to figure out which method is actually implementing the particular method you're trying to call. And so this can occur if you compose mixins that inherit from other mixins, you can run into this problem. So one thing I recommend, so this page on the Python website actually goes into detail on how this method resolution thing works. And we'll also, later on, I'll talk about a way to avoid this problem altogether. So this is actually an example where I ran into this problem in my own code to kind of give you an idea. So I'm building a system for doing deployment automation and have this class, a resource, that represents something I'm going to install. And I have various mixins to describe the properties of that resource. So I have one mixin, and I'm obviously ignoring all the details of all the methods of the classes, right? But just for the example, so this one is where I need SUDO access to do the installation. So there's a particular mixin that has methods defined for doing that. And if I'm using something that's going to use the apt package manager, there's a mixin for that. And to use that, I actually need SUDO access, so I'm inheriting from the other mixin. Then I have a mixin for doing file level backups, and that also requires SUDO access, so it's inheriting from that. So now when I'm creating my little installer for Apache, I ran into this problem because I'm basically taking from this mixin and this mixin, which inherit from this other mixin. And when I do this, I actually get the error. And you can, by changing the orders of this sequence, you can avoid that error. But it gets to be very complicated, and there are situations where there's no way you can actually subclass from a given class. And if you read that one page, you can see examples. But this was a real example I ran into in my own coding. So this can get complicated. So I'll kind of go into later an example of how to avoid this issue altogether with mixins. So another issue is that you may have multiple mixins. And so here again, the idea is we're trying to combine independent code. And they may define some state fields. And they may define like a private state fields, let's say status. And so these two mixins are defining the status field, but they have different meanings. So this mixin is assuming that it basically is defining it and using it internally. But for the locked door class, so this is going back to our example of our adventure game. For the locked door class, basically it's saying what the status field is saying, whether it's locked or not. And for the magic door, it's basically telling you whether there's a spell activated for the door. So now we want to combine them in locked magic door. And what happens then when we do this is one of these is going to override the other, and the other class is basically going to have its values overridden. So that's not what you want. And the thing is, if you're just composing these classes and you don't look at the internal implementation, you won't be aware of that. So this is something to be careful of with mixins. So the final issue is basically, let's say you have some method and many of the different mixins implement this method and you want some way to aggregate the results. So you can do that. So here we want to say whether the door can be opened. You can do that, but ideally you don't want to be using this style where you're directly referring to your base classes, because you're kind of hard coding that inheritance and implementation into the thing. So you'd like a more elegant solution. So here's kind of my recommendations on how to get around these issues. So the first one is you can basically avoid having any state altogether in your mixins and basically just call methods. Or if you need to maintain some internal state, there are some truly private fields that are available in Python specifically created for this feature, and you can read about it in the Python tutorial. And basically, if you put a double underscore in front of the field name, it's going to mangle the field and put the class name appended to the field name internally. And then you can basically avoid these issues and you have a truly private member. So the other thing is to avoid this inheritance in your mixins, and then you don't have all these problems with method resolution order. And that also that example of combining methods gets simpler. So to avoid inheritance, what you can do is basically directly inherit from object or some other base class. And then basically if there are some methods that you're expecting, you can basically check for them in your init function. And basically here's some code that will look through basically the attributes. So you basically tell it, here's my object, here's the methods I need. And it's basically going to check that they're defined by some class in your composition. And then you can just document it in your class doc string saying I need this method. But when you actually try to instantiate the class, it'll check that it's there. So if you do this, then you can kind of combine these mixins in any order and you don't have problems. So if we look at this installer deployment tool example, so here's where I kind of solve my method resolution order by using this pattern. So basically, my sudo mixin is defining this get password method. And so these other two subclasses need it. And so rather than subclassing from sudo mixin, they basically just declare they need this get password method. And then if you try to instantiate this class without including it in your inheritance, then basically these will give you an error. So then in my Apache resource, I can just mix these arbitrarily, and I don't care what the order is, and everything will work fine. So I guess in conclusion, mixins are a great way that you can basically combine orthogonal functionality, and in Python, kind of the standard way to do it is using multiple inheritance, but multiple inheritance can get a little tricky. So my recommendation is to kind of use some of these techniques, and you can basically have a saner implementation of mixins. Thanks.